Hey guys, it's Seeney here, and today I have a couple of tips about some of the basics of photography and videography and the things that you need to know. Okay, so our eyes are a lot like a camera. What our eyes and our brain are doing are constantly trying to balance the amount of light that we see so that things aren't too bright and they're not too dark and we can see exactly what's going on. Now, a camera is much the same. You want to be balancing a few different things so that you're getting exactly the right amount of light into the camera. So the amount of light balance that you have in a camera is called exposure. So if a picture is way too bright, it's overexposed. If a picture is too dark, then it's underexposed. Now there's three things that we use to balance a picture. The first one is aperture. Now the aperture is basically like the pupil of your eye. It constricts, it closes and opens, and that will determine how much light actually gets to the sensor. So obviously, the tighter that is, the less light can get into the camera, and the wider it is, the more light is going to get into the camera. Now, aperture also has another interesting effect. If you're shooting with a low aperture, so you have an f-stop that's low, such as 2.8 or even lower, you could go 1.2, somewhere around there, is it has a very shallow depth of field, which means that only in a very specific point is it going to be focused. If you're shooting with a shallow depth of field, you'll see that a lot of the background will be out of focus. Whereas if you shoot on a really high aperture number, so f22, when the aperture hole is quite small and it's not letting much light in, you'll see that a lot more of your picture is in focus. So to get that really blurry, faded out background look that you see a lot of in the Hollywood movies, the way to do that is to shoot with a really low aperture. So you want it to be really wide. So shooting at an f1.2 or an f1.8. So you'll have to be very careful with your focus because it's very easy for things that aren't quite in the right spot to get out of focus. So aperture is the first way. The second way that you can adjust the amount of light that's coming into the camera is, of course, the shutter speed. Now, when you're shooting video, you want your shutter speed to be double what your frame rate is. So if you're shooting at a regular 25 frames a second, then your shutter speed should be at 50. You can tweak this a little bit. You can put it up to 60, maybe down to 40, but it's not going to look as good as it could. So you probably want to keep it on 50 and try and adjust the aperture first. You'll notice that if you have your shutter speed too fast, the picture starts to look a little bit weird and it's not really what you would see like in real life. So this is about 250 instead of 50. So you can see that when I move my hands and I kind of move my hands pretty fast, that they kind of jolt. So you don't want this shutter speed when you're shooting video. And you'll notice that if I have my shutter speed too low, so here it's as low as I can get it. I'm shooting 25 frames a second, so every single one of those frames is fully exposed, and you'll see that my hand starts to get really blurry. And that's not something you want. So you want to keep that about 50 and compensate for your light in other ways when you're doing video. Now for photography, this doesn't matter so much. If you're shooting action sports, you probably want to try and let as much light into the camera with the aperture and have it really wide so that you can have that shutter speed being very fast, so you're not getting that sort of blurriness that you would with a higher shutter speed, because the camera's taking a photo for longer. So the more movement there is in that time, it's going to capture that. So the faster the better for action shots. However, if you're shooting a nice waterfall, you might want to get that long exposure of the rain falling down to make it look really dreamy and kind of milky. And the way to do that, of course, is to have a bit longer exposure of a second, 2 seconds, sometimes even up to 20 seconds. Now, if you are doing those kind of shots, you're definitely going to need a tripod because it's very easy to shake the camera with an exposure longer than a second. Okay, so we've talked about aperture and we've talked about shutter speed. Now, let's say you want to shoot something really fast and you're letting in as much light as possible, but you haven't quite got enough light. What else can you do? So the last thing that you can do if you need to bring more light into the camera is bump up your ISO and bring more gain from the sensor into the camera, so it will basically brighten everything. So using the ISO is a very effective tool if you're shooting in an area that doesn't really have enough light. You can always bump that up and just get a little bit more light from the gain of the sensor as opposed to the actual light coming through the lens. But something that you will have to be a little bit careful of when you're bumping up the ISO is the more you bump up the ISO, the more noise it creates. So obviously more expensive cameras will allow you to bump up the ISO number a little bit more without getting any of that noise that you would get. However, on sort of more beginner cameras, the more you bump up the ISO, the more noise you're going to get in your picture, so you do have to be careful with that as well. So it's all about finding the balance between those three things. So the balance is absolutely crucial to getting great photos and great video. So basically, you don't want your picture to be too dark, you don't want your blacks to kind of disappear and lose heaps of detail in the shadows, and you also don't want to lose some of those highlights that you get in the sky. You don't want it to be blown out, you want to be able to see what's in the sky. So sometimes you do have to make a compromise and sit sort of somewhere in the middle so that you're not losing too much detail in the blacks and you're not losing too much detail in the whites. So once you have your exposure correct, it makes it a lot easier to get those photos in post-production or the video in post-production and tweak it so it looks exactly how you want to. If something's already getting pushed really hard, like you've lost all the highlights already or you've lost all the shadows already, then it's going to be quite hard to get that detail back. But if you shoot right in the first place, then it's going to be there and you'll be able to tweak it a little bit more. So thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you found this useful, talking about aperture, the shutter speed, and the ISO, and how that creates the exposure. So thank you guys so much for watching. Make sure you like and subscribe to the channel, and we'll see you later.